Welcome back to Debrief. As we just touched on a little bit, the deep divisions opening up in the Gulf continuing to shake up the Middle East and to even draw commentary from Washington and President Trump himself once again. But today, a little bit of a change of tone from Saudi Arabia, who led the charge in cutting off all ties with Qatar. The kingdom's top diplomat calling Qatar a brother state now and a friend who needs reforming. At this point, 9 governments, including the Saudi kingdom, Egypt, and Jordan, have cut off ties with Qatar in one form or another. Backing the country only Turkey, Indonesia, and Saudi arch-rival Iran. And in the middle of it all, Kuwait attempting to play mediator. Our senior Middle East correspondent, Mohammed Al-Qasim, joining me here now. Mohammed, Saudi Arabia, first of all, a lot of developments in this today, including Donald Trump. We'll get to that in a moment. But Saudi Arabia laid out some conditions. If you want to be our friend again, do this.
That's correct. Number of issues that the Saudi government feels troubled about, and they're accusing Qatar of actually committing. And they're saying in order for the relationship to get back to where it was before we severed diplomatic relationships, then Qatar must adhere to them. Let's have a look at what they are. The first one is that Qatar must abandon its policy of supporting Muslim Brotherhood and other extremist groups in the region. The other extremist groups, we're talking about Hamas. Also step back from its growing relationship with Iran and with Hezbollah, which is considered a terrorist group by the Gulf cooperation country. Another thing is that they must expel all Hamas members and leadership out of Qatar and freeze their bank account. This is an extremely troubling issue for the Hamas movement and its supporters. And also they're demanding a formal apology from the Qatari government into all the Gulf countries by what the Al Jazeera network that is sponsored by Qatar and based out of Qatar has been reporting on offending these countries. And also vow not to ever take any political role against any policies of these Gulf countries. Those are very strict, very tough conditions. I'm not sure if the Qatari government will actually agree to them.
Well, President Trump is offering to play mediator. We'll get to that in a moment. I want to bring in Matthew Brodsky he's a Middle East and geopolitical analyst at Wikistrat, joining us from our studios in Washington. Matthew, great to have you. So let's talk Trump for a moment. First, yesterday, we had Trump coming out and sort of claiming this rift as a victory, as a product of his conference that he held with those Gulf states. Today, coming out and saying, I will help mediate.
Right. That probably wasn't the best maneuver on his part diplomatically to be trying to handle it through a tweet, but certainly it does provide an opportunity for the United States in trying to get Qatar to curb its duplicitous behavior. And so certainly while this is a regional issue that the United States is now going to or could be involved in, there's definitely a role we could play toward mediation, or at least toward pushing Qatar toward the position of U.S. And its allies. And this is incidentally what we should be doing as well with Turkey.
Well, you mentioned Turkey. Turkish parliament passed legislation to send Turkish troops to Qatar. That sounds like an escalation. Where do you think that will go?
I think it's symbolic. It's not really welcome in Washington, but I think whatever deal was going to be worked out regarding the United States and using the Kurds to retake Raqqa in Syria, or to liberate the city from ISIS, that deal has already been worked out in May when Erdogan came to the White House and met with Trump. So this might be just a symbolic move, but certainly as far as the orbit is concerned, the Turkish and Qatar have been creating a much deeper alliance recently, and they find themselves on the same side currently with Iran. And that's different, of course, than where the United States is, and that's different from the position that the other Sunni Arab states, specifically the GCC states, are taking right now.
Matthew, what do you think the end game is for Saudi Arabia and for President Trump in sort of initiating this split between Gulf nations, telling Qatar to rein back its support for extremism, and then saying, well, if you live up to these conditions, we'll come back to the table and we'll work together again?
Well, I think it's very important that they get Qatar to change their behavior, and there's every indication that they will. Whether they'll adopt the plan in its entirety that Saudi Arabia is putting forward through that level of diplomacy, we'll see. And of course, Qatar does have leverage, having the U.S. Al Udeid air base there. But the United States needs to not lose sight of the fact that Qatar is behaving outside the norm of what we'd like to see, or what the United States would like to see. So we need to push them in the right direction. And look, what is happening today by everyone ganging together against Qatar, it could signify many things. A lot of the things that it could be signifying are overly optimistic, but one of the things could be an issue is that these states have understood that by supporting so many different Islamist groups and exporting them, that they come back to bite later and it causes more problems. Qatar has had to pay no price because of its homogeneous population, its wealth, and because of its distance from the center of the region's conflicts.
Matthew.
So once it knows that there is a price attached, that could make a difference.
Matthew, stay with us. Mohammed, what Matthew is saying, the description of Qatar as supporting terrorism over some time, supporting extremist ideology, having a lot of money from oil and not having any blowback, that also sounds a little bit like Saudi Arabia.
Exactly, and it sounds even like other countries in Europe and maybe in North America. Saudi Arabia even goes as far as supporting more extremist groups than Qatar does. They're both involved, ironically, in Syria in supporting groups that are considered terrorist groups by international communities. So what Saudi is doing by accusing Qatar of supporting and financing extremist groups is something that is doing. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood isn't even considered a terrorist group by the U.S. Only Hamas, and recently Hezbollah is only considered a terrorist group by the Gulf countries, and we know that it is in Europe. So both sides are at fault of supporting and sponsoring certain extremist groups in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere.
Matthew, should the U.S. administration be holding Saudi Arabia accountable also for its exporting of extremist ideology?
Absolutely. But what we might be seeing here under this Trump administration, as opposed to under Obama, is they're going to do that they're going to do that below the radar, essentially. They're not going to be out screaming as Obama was doing to Israel. And I will agree, of course, Saudi Arabia has engaged in very poor behavior, and Trump didn't take the opportunity while he was in Saudi Arabia to say that, at least publicly, or to point to the fact that Saudi Arabia has, including the king itself today, has given millions of dollars to terrorists over the years. But that's why I'm saying that it could signify a hopeful change, and that is if some of the countries are willing to turn the page right now, then it could be that Qatar hasn't gotten the memo, and when they see that there's a price attached, they might be more willing to get on board, because there's little for them waiting except for Turkey and Iran. Basically, that will come down to the Trump administration being able to sell the alliance as being ironclad enough that Qatar feels it doesn't need to hedge its own bets, thinking that it might as well side or play the middle with Iran just in case the Arab world can't stand up to it.
Matthew Brodsky in Washington, thanks very much for being with us. Quick final thoughts.
Well, I think that the situation will calm down, but I don't think that there will be a resolution to this crisis anytime soon. Kuwait is trying, the U.S. now is trying, but it'll be a few more weeks, if not even months, before the situation gets back to where it used to be.
Mohammed Al-Qasim, thanks very much for that. We'll see if it gets back to where it used to be or an entirely new reality. When we're back on Debrief, a big day in Washington. A new FBI director announced several revelations about former Director James Comey's interactions with the president before, and a heated grilling of senior officials on Capitol Hill with very few answers. Don't go anywhere.